All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College Application and Website Development, or AWD 1111, database-driven web development course, I've been doing a series of video presentations to kind of bring everybody up to speed, so to speak. I've done about 25 videos based on Mr. Flavio Cope's, some of the PDFs that he's created in his Valley of Code website, and they were all server-side web development. So in other words, I did several on HTML, several on CSS, several on JavaScript. I also went back and added some of the PowerPoint presentations I had done for the AWD 1000 class because we use the JavaScript jQuery textbook from Muroc. All right, so I've got those, and now I'm going through Brad Traversy's web dev guide, and it's 306 pages. Mr. Traversy is a self-taught web developer. He knows more than just web, but he's got a lot of good stuff in here, and I'm up to page 103, which is chapter 3, which is on front-end development in advanced. So as it says, in this chapter, we will talk about more advanced tools you will need to learn as a front-end or full-stack developer. Examples are frameworks testing, server-rendered pages, and statically generated websites. I will tell you that the majority of the stuff in this chapter, which is about 60 pages or so, I have heard of before. That said, there are quite a few things that are in here that I know what they are, but I've never used them. So again, I'm just trying to be totally straight with you here. Okay. Front-end frameworks. The author says, like I stated in the last chapter, I think this is the best option to move to next for front-end developers as well as full-stack developers. You can create server-rendered pages using template engines with Python, PHP, Node.js, and other languages. What do these frameworks have in common? You'll find they all kind of do the same thing. The syntax will be a little different, and the way they do it will be a little bit different. So one of the things that's big, so to speak, in web development right now is the idea of using single-page applications, which are typically called SPAs. All right? It says when I say front end, that refers to a client side and what are called SPAs. This means the browser only needs to load a single page, a single HTML page from the server. Everything else is done via JavaScript. What you end up getting with your website is more of a desktop application feel. It's much smoother as you iterate, all right, your way through the website. And it says here React, Angular, and Vue. And just like there's a MERN stack, MongoDB, Express, React, and Node.js, there's a mean stack, MongoDB, Express, Angular, and Node. And there's a Maven stack, MongoDB, Express, Vue, and Node. All right, it says all of them have a single index.html file. And the only HTML that's in there, this is what you're going to see when we get into React. This is really, for lack of better words, this is what we're going to have in the body of our React documents. All right, we'll have an index.html file that in the body will have this. The root is just, it's a name. There's nothing significant about it. It doesn't have to be root, but by default and by standard, it is. It says it loads up a JavaScript bundle where it takes this root element and inserts the entire front end right there. And if that confuses you, this is what the part of the class is all about. It says when data is loaded, it is requested from a server or backend via AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript, and XML. Even though most of it does not use XML anymore, it uses JSON calls using something like the Fetch API or Axios, and then load it into the UI. If you want a little more on this and on AJAX, you can go back and review in what I showed earlier from my particular website playlist, and I think it was chapter 18 that went into Ajax. So it says here, these are traditional web applications. Let's move this there. So in a traditional, all right, the big thing is with a traditional, let's say that I've got a home page and I've got an about page and I've got a contact page. It's not a single page app. All right. There are multiple pages in it. You still have the front end, the back end, etc. All right. But it's not nearly as slick as this is. Now look here, client side front end. So the presentation layer, which is on the server side traditionally, has now been moved to the front end. And our response, rather than it coming back as HTML, it's coming back as JSON. And rather than a typical HTTP or Hypertext Transfer Protocol or HTTPS, a Hypertext Transfer Protocol secure request, we're making an API request using Ajax. So it says here, there are ways to run these frameworks on the server side, which we'll talk about soon, but these are inherently client-side or front-end frameworks. There's a lot of similarities between the frameworks. They all use components. Menus, toolbars, etc. are all created as components. If the idea of a component sounds foreign to you or it confuses you, let's look as an example, just show you this quickly, and I'm going to go out to regular YouTube. All right. And when we go out to YouTube, what do we have here? We've got a bunch of containers. We've got one container that holds everything. You could say that each one of these are a container. We could say that each container has other containers in it. We could say that the index on the side here is yet another container. So the idea of using containers should not be foreign to you, in that what we are doing is we are modularizing. We're taking one big thing and we're breaking it up into a lot of smaller things. All right. Some components may simply be HTML output that don't do anything else, and some are smart components that have logic built into them. Every framework has a different way of creating a component. Let's look here about React, because that's what we're going to be using. It says React used to use mainly classes because they could hold state. Now, classes, class-based components in React are still used, but there's been more of a movement over the last few years to move to function-based components, which use something that's called hooks to use state. And if you go, I don't get that, you don't have to right now. So this next page, this Vue.js, I don't care about it because we're not going to use Vue. All right. But one thing that is important in here when you are working with any of these frameworks is the idea of state. Notice here, state is basically just data. There is local component state. So this could be something like a Boolean value in a menu to say that menu is open or that menu is closed. Local state only has to do with a single component's property. We also have global or app level state, which goes across different components. And this is a good example because it's the one most articles will use, and that is a blog. So it says if you have a blog, the posts that you fetch from the back end will be put into global state so that they can be accessed, so you can click on any one of them. There are many ways to do this, including built-in methods, as well as third-party state managers like Redux, which typically works with React. It says, now let's look at some of the actual frameworks that are available to us. Remember, these are front-end frameworks. Something like Express, Laravel, Django are server-side, which get discussed later on. So this is what much of the class is going to be about. Now, some of you, if you have taken more than one course and probably, I don't know, I should say that. But if you are based or were based out of the St. Louis campus, all right, Clayton, this might, I guess, especially be somebody like you. You may have taken a class or been fortunate enough to take a class with Mr. Paul Smith. All right. And the reason I say this is Mr. Smith has left Rankin and gone back into business and industry. But Paul is like, I would describe him as a sponge. And what I mean is not sponge like cheap or anything. No, he is an intellectual sponge. He can drink in anything about anything and retain it. He's just really good that way. And when I asked Mr. Smith, Paul, when I asked him, how do you teach React? And he said, well, we have to go through all the other stuff in the class first. We have to go through and we have to talk about Node. We have to talk about relational databases like MySQL. We've got to talk about non-relational databases like Mongo. We have to talk about the Node package manager. We have to talk about promises, web tokens, etc. So I usually spend the last couple weeks only going over React. And I know that Mr. Gudmested has told me that he has started to add React into the last week or two, just a very basic exposure in the AWD 1000 class. I have not yet put that in, but when I start teaching that, which should be in spring, I'm going to have a component with React in it as well. All right. So who cares? Well, let's talk about React. As it says, React is the most popular framework by many metrics. And one of the reasons is it's fairly easy to use, especially when you compare it to Vue and Angular and some of the other frameworks. All right. It's technically, as it says, a UI or a user interface library because it doesn't have everything a framework typically has. For instance, it doesn't have a router built in, but you can go and add one. All right. It is directly in competition with things like Angular. React was created and is still maintained by Facebook. It says as far as the learning curve, I would say it's moderate. It's not the easiest and it's not the hardest. Things you learn with React. We're going to be doing right away is we're going to be using Create React App. As it says, it is a CLI or a command line interface tool that you can use to generate React apps. We will work with React Router, as it says, a package to create routes and link them in React. We will do extensive work with JSX. Mr. Traversy says JSX is JavaScript extensions. I've seen it mean other things too. The JS is definitely JavaScript. All right. Basically, what JSX does is it allows you to write a language that is HTML-like and put it right within your JavaScript. All right. We will talk about hooks, as it says, used in functional components, which is what we're basically going to be using to hook into the lifecycle and access state. Context API to manage global state, and Redux, which is a global state manager. All right, it says a lot of people ask me if we still need Redux now that we have Context API and hooks. I would say that Redux is still superior for very large applications, but again, that's his opinion. I'm going to skip the Vue stuff, and I'm going to skip the Angular stuff. There's nothing wrong with either one of these. I'm going to skip the Svelte stuff too. All right. There's just not enough time to talk about everything. And I want to hit you with the stuff that we're going to be talking about, learning about in the AWD 1111 class. All right. Just about every framework has a browser extension to help aid you in development. All right. So how do you choose a framework? His advice is that you try all of them and choose the one that you feel clicks with you. We have made the decision to come in here and use Node and use React with Node. All right. Now it says the next technology that they're going to talk about is TypeScript. All right. And as it says, I believe that TypeScript was Stack Overflow's second most loved language in 2021. It's a superset of JavaScript. In English, that means it can do everything JavaScript can do and then some. All right, it says the main feature and what most people use it for is static type checking. That's where the type in TypeScript came about. JavaScript is a dynamically typed language, meaning you define a variable or function, you don't have to define the type of that variable. Not only that, you can change the type of data that gets put into that variable as the program runs. All right. Some languages, like most of the other ones we teach here, like C#, like Java, are statically typed, which means that you define the types manually, and once you've defined them, they have to stick to that data type, and they can only hold that type of data. It says here is an example of a really simple TypeScript function. What is this? It's a function. Its name is add. All right. It has two parameters, one called num1, which is of type number, one called num2, which is of type number, and this is going to return a number. That number in particular will be the num1 plus the num2. So as it says here, as you can see, TypeScript adds the option to add types to JavaScript. It is completely optional. It also offers classes and module support and ES6 features like arrow functions. You can use TypeScript on its own with a TypeScript compiler, but it's also easily added with tools like Create React App. There's only so much that we can do in a semester, but after you finish, this might be a good next step. All right, and it says TypeScript is used at a lot of companies, and it's used with front-end frameworks as well as with back-end with Node.js. There's the URL you can go out to if you'd like to hear about more. All right. UI kits and libraries, as the author says, now that you know a front-end framework, you have lots of choices for styling and design. Of course, you could just use a global style sheet, or you could have separate style sheets for each component. There are other examples as well, such as styled components. And it says here, this is a great library that allows you to create just that. All right, I have looked at this. I have done virtually nothing with it. Okay, so I'm not going to spend much time on most any of this stuff. All right. You have the option of using a UI kit, also known as a UI library. Each framework has a bunch of kits to choose from. Some of them more popular. The React one, this is one that we'll probably end up looking at, and that's Material User Interface. It's based on the Google Material Design. As he says, this is his pick. I'm going to skip the Chakra, Onsen, and jump right down to React Bootstrap. React Bootstrap, it says there, as its name implies, is a UI library based on the Bootstrap CSS framework. So all of the elements of Bootstrap are available as React components. Here's some Vue stuff. This is Boofy. I'm not sure what it does. There's Bootstrap Vue. There's some Angular kits. Some Svelte kits, some Smelt kits, some Svelte Strap kits. All right. And let's just jump up to here. He talks next about Alpine.js. And he says, I'm not really sure where to fit this in, but I really want to talk about Alpine.js. It is technically a JavaScript front-end framework, but it's much more lightweight and you use it in different ways than others. When you use React or Vue, you build an entire app around the framework structure. Alpine is more jQuery-like. Everything is done within the HTML. And as it says there, as you can see from the image above, it's simple to create a button and toggle something on the page. You don't have to leave the HTML at all. And if you want more, again, these are things that you'd probably end up going and using and learning about, etc. once you became a little bit more proficient in this. All right, testing. As he says, testing is something that I've often said I don't do enough of. Every time you run a program, in essence, you're testing it. That should make sense. All right. It says once you take the time to learn how to test, you'll see the benefit. And the main benefit of testing is this. The earlier in the development process you find an error, the cheaper it is to fix it. Back in the 1980s, before most of you were alive, all right, I was a developer at AT&T Bell Laboratories. In particular, I rose to the rank of Senior Technical Associate, STA, and I was a C# programmer. Who cares? Well, I worked there for about 4 years, and the last year that I was there, I decided I'd like to try doing something different. So I went over to the testing side where I wasn't writing code, but I was writing tests to test the code. And one of the things that we were told, one of the things I was told when I first started there, as far as how cheap it can be, is they said that typically if you're at the beginning of the development cycle, so you haven't done very much, and you discover some kind of an error that's been made in what you're working on, it typically costs in the range of about $50 to $100 to fix it. Now, again, that was 40 years ago, so it could be quite a bit more. But they had tracked errors, and they had an error that was in code that nobody had found. These were all things for the telephone company, okay? And once they cut over and they took the old software out of the main computers and put the new software in, what happened was some towns literally lost total phone service. Now, this is back in the day of rotary phones. I get that. But the point is this. That error cost the company $5 million. $50 versus $5 million. So the earlier in the process you find whatever it is, the problem is, the cheaper it is to fix it. All right. So types of testing. Unit testing. Your code is typically going to be put into different units. In fact, where I worked, they were called design units. All right. And it was a series of functions that all worked together. So when you unit test, you're basically testing those specific blocks. By writing tests for the smallest testable units and the behaviors, you can build up more comprehensive tests. What I had to do as a developer for the phone company is I had to write what was called a design unit document. And it literally was the biggest thing I'd ever written at the time. It was 500 pages because each page had on it a test that I was going to run on my code. And then it also had on it what a successful run of that test would look like and what an unsuccessful run would look like. And I had to go and test and do all those tests before it would be accepted. Then we went to our testing unit. Their goal was to break my code. This was another unit at AT&T Bell Labs. And you're like, why would they want to break your code? Because we want them to break it so it's still internal in-house and not external where we send it out to different Bell operating companies. All right. You typically do integration testing in conjunction with unit testing. Unit testing, as it says, tests blocks of code. Integration testing will show how these blocks work together. Then there's end-to-end testing, which, as it says, is just that. It goes from beginning to end in your application lifecycle to make sure that nothing's been broken. Some of the popular testing methods. We don't use a lot of these here, just so you know. Should we be using them more? Of course. as it says, here's a very simple example of testing a sum function with what's called jest. All right, so we're testing it, and we expect that to be 3. So you run the program and check whether or not indeed it is. Now that is a very dumbed down example. All right. All right, I'm at 25 minutes. It seems like right here, page 128 would be a pretty good place to stop. So I'll pick it up again with the next part of the lecture.